Thank you, and hello everyone. Thanks for attending. Today's topic is change management, and I guess specifically in this case, I guess in the context of how Autodesk Fusion 360 Manage um, presents and handles change management. But I really like the way Fusion 360 Manage is configured by default to handle change. It provides a lot of capability if you need it, but can be configured or simpler workflows if necessary. So I thought I would take the opportunity today to, I guess, sort of discuss change in general and how change can be managed, and do that in the context, again, of Fusion 360 Manage capability, or I should say default configuration, um, just because of how comprehensive it can be if you put it all to use. So we'll be starting today with, I guess we'll kind of be going through the change process, more or less up to the point of where a change might become effective. We'll at least describe, say, the different um, workflows, different methodologies, different inputs to the system, and also, how you can use some of Fusion 360 Manage's tools to help make sure the change process gets executed smoothly. So we'll start with talking about how issues might be identified or raised in an environment, essentially how changes could be requested, um, how you might go about reviewing those requests and getting the changes started, um, identifying and resolving systemic problems, not just here's something that happened, let's fix it, but these 10 things have happened over the last 3 months, and that's indicative of a larger problem. How do we solve the larger problem versus just putting out fires, right? Which can be extremely difficult to do if you don't have a rich history of change data and the ability to quickly summarize and make decisions about it, right? You just put fires out all day instead of preventing the fires in the first place. And then a little bit at the end, more about reporting, about how to keep the change process on track, not just pushing buttons for buttons' sake, let's say, but using what you might do daily in something like Fusion 360 Manage to make sure that the process itself is running smoothly, and identifying where it isn't and resolving those things. So let's start with how you might identify issues and where the change process really begins, right? Because in a perfect world, we would design a product or a part, a component, an assembly, and it would be right the first time, and nothing would need to change. Before I came to Hagerman, quite a long time ago now, I was a designer for several years. I designed any number of custom pieces of equipment, and one time ever did I have a design that that never didn't need to change at all. That was coincidentally after I moved to Autodesk Inventor. I don't know that it's even possible with something like, say, AutoCAD. But even with powerful parametric design tools today, if we're designing equipment, things change. And even if we did it perfectly, maybe the customer has a request. They want something to change, and so we have to meet their needs, right? So where changes come up, they could come up on say internal to engineering when you are having a design review, or maybe you're doing some testing of prototypes, right? And those problems, keeping it inside engineering before you've actually released something, are usually relatively straightforward to solve, right? You may or may not keep track officially of something like that. Maybe it's just a meeting or an email to a colleague saying, hey, I found this problem when I was looking through your drawings, could you fix it, right? Once it gets to the point where you're building something, it gets a little more complicated. More people get involved. You need to communicate revisions, and the fact that something has changed, and depending on the scope of that problem, it might grow or shrink. But then if you end up with issues once something has actually gotten to a customer, then it becomes a much bigger deal, right? So that to me is sort of like a very general hierarchy of problems, and And the sooner you can capture a problem and resolve it, the simpler that problem is typically going to be to solve. If nothing else, fewer people are involved, right? Um, in terms of, how do we find out about issues? And again, this may just be, obvious to some people, but I thought it bore, just laying out. If it's a simple problem, maybe somebody just comes to your desk and says, "Hey, I found this issue. Can you fix it?" Right? Some of our customers still use like paper forms. Somebody actually takes a piece of paper and writes on it, or it could be a drawing. Maybe a marked up drawing appears on your desk. Sometimes without any explanation, you just go to lunch and you come back and there's a oil stained drawing on your desk with red lines all over it, and maybe you have to find out who dropped it off. You might get an email or a phone call from somebody. If your environment's a little more sophisticated, maybe you have, like an official form that tracks, maybe like an investigation request, or, maybe a problem report where there's an Excel spreadsheet, or maybe you've got a homegrown database. And then sort of I would say top end in terms of complexity these days is if you've got some business system that's capturing this stuff. So an ERP system, a PLM system like Fusion 360 Manage, maybe a CRM might, have the concept of an RMA, right? If a customer had a problem, right? So, and our customers run this whole spectrum between, extremely informal communication of issues that just somehow get fixed. This is typically, constantly putting out fires level, right? Because, that's what people see are the fires. It's really when you get into using more defined systems and, electronic systems to help you manage this information, where you can start to make decisions that solve underlying problems and not just the problem of the day. Right, and just sort of an illustration, of the severity and complexity of issues when they appear. Something within engineering, a couple people might be involved. Maybe you've got a peer review process, and Bob says, "Hey, I looked at your drawings, and I found this is probably going to be an issue. I'm afraid, if we don't set this tolerance a little tighter, then we might have, an issue, with functionality or even, assembly." Right, and that's a simple, okay, let me think about it. Yeah, well, let's do it. And maybe you've solved a problem right there. Now, if that happens to you 10 times in a month, maybe there's an issue where, okay, we need to, as a group, think more carefully about tolerancing, right? But it can be hard, especially day to day, to identify, recurring and systemic problems and solve them. So even at a level like this, it can be extremely beneficial just to keep track of, here's an issue we found and here's how we solved it, right? But in a lot of cases, you don't really need anything complex if you're just solving problems within engineering. And once it gets outside of engineering, it becomes a much bigger deal. You have a lot more people involved. If this is something got raised like during assembly or on the line, um, maybe someone on the floor found an issue, maybe it was a quality issue. Now you've got people from quality involved in manufacturing, and you've got to release official revisions, and maybe it was a supplier component and now you've got a supplier involved. Things start to get much more complex. And then if you get all the way to the point where you've shipped a product and you've started having problems, customers have started having problems, the scope of the issue and the requirement to manage the change becomes much more difficult. You've got all those people internally still involved, but then sales and marketing gets involved. The customer, obviously, maybe depending on the scope and your business, maybe even regulatory agencies have gotten involved. So change management runs, it's a very general term, right? But the basic concepts apply, I think, across the board. It's just the scope of the problem and the tools you use to solve it, right? Now, why this is important, up and down the chain, and regardless of the level of severity of an issue or a change that's required, if you can identify a problem sooner rather than later, and I think this makes intuitive sense if nothing else, that's your best chance to keep that a small problem, right? If we find an issue way back here and fix it, then it's not an issue here when we've got 30 people involved, right? We found it early and fixed it, right? And if we have a good framework for raising issues so that whoever identifies the issue can make sure it gets captured and gets worked to solution, we're going to find these problems sooner, and it's going to be our best chance to keep them from becoming big problems, right? And if you can capture sufficient or as much information as possible about the issue accurately, those issues get solved more quickly too, right? So a good example is someone sends you an email and says, I'm having a problem with X. Well, that really doesn't tell you anything other than they're having a problem, right? So now just looking at that, if you've got a list of 10 things you have to do today, and 9 of them are well defined and you know exactly what you have to do and you can execute to get those done, and that 10th one is like, well, I'm going to have to spend 2 hours tracking down this person and figuring out even what the problem is. Let me get these other 9 things fixed first. And then that other problem goes to the next day and the next day. It's like, well, if it's important, they'll ask me again, right? So, it's very easy for problems that are nebulous and poorly defined to get put on the back burner, because if nothing else, a lot of effort is going to go into trying to even figure out what the problem is. And if that is a significant problem, putting it off is just going to make things worse, right? So properly identifying issues, capturing sufficient information early in the process is critical, again, to getting them solved in a timely manner and keeping them from increasing in scope. Right. So in the context of Fusion Manage and all of that, not even talking about any software or Autodesk products specifically, to me, at least in my experience working with many different customers across many different industries, that intuitively makes sense. You need to identify problems, you need to solve them quickly. Everyone wants to get them solved, but we often don't have the tools we need to help us get them solved in the most efficient manner. And that's where something like Fusion Manage can come in, and some of its tools for reporting issues and how it works. And one of the reasons I like it so much is because this tool is built around letting people do their daily tasks, and just by executing their day-to-day task and keeping track of it in something like this, things get done, right? So if we look at Fusion Manage here, we have the concept of different, what we call workspaces, that involve different types of work. And in this case, we're looking at change management and quality kind of go hand in hand, right? Quality is making sure things get done right. And if something doesn't get done right, you got to change something. So they're really, in my mind, quality and change management are really two parts of a whole. So if we're talking about quality, we have the concept of, inspections. We could have people that, when they're doing an inspection, whether it be a first article inspection or you're manually inspecting some percentage of the product that you create, if they're doing an inspection, they've got some, plan that they need to follow. Here's my part, here's the critical dimensions, here's what I need to make sure is accurate. If you just pass fail then and move on, and then you're missing an opportunity to collect a lot of information, first of all. And if you're not capturing information about here's the part, here's when it passed, and or if it failed, what failed, you're missing a lot of opportunity. And so if you just look at a quality inspection, something like this, we receive parts from a supplier. Let's say here's the plan, basically what we're supposed to do. And in this case, this is again Fusion 360 Manage. It's extremely configurable. In this case, this inspection is here's what you're supposed to do, right? You're supposed to measure max power draw and resistance, right? So this is just what they're doing. They're doing inspections all day. They can have Fusion Manage up here in a browser, even on a tablet right next to them if they needed to. They execute their inspection and they just put in their values. And in this case, You know, something like Fusion Manage can even be configured so that the user themselves, they don't have to say, yes, this passed or this failed. You know, they just put in their value, what they inspected, the value that they provided, right? And if, you know, this is, you know, 25, for example, that's way off of 0.45, you know, that failed. So they don't even have to think about things, right? And they're just capturing this information. And then ultimately, again, there's some workflow associated with this, right? It's currently open. I take my measurements and then I say it's done, right? You know, we have now a lot of information about, you know, our printer here and about the results of that inspection. And nobody had to think too hard. Nobody had to use some hard to use tool or think about, well, this failed. It failed by a lot. Who do I tell? What do I do? Right? They just did their job, right? They just did what they were supposed to do. Right? And similarly, things like a non-conformance or an RMA, right? A customer calls with an issue or reports a problem with a component. You know, you can have a process involved that both resolves the customer's issue, right? How critical is this? Is it a line down situation for our customer? Is it a cosmetic issue that they're just kind of unhappy with that we can address, right? You know, and this both, and we'll see later on down the line, not only does this solve the customer's immediate problem, but it gives us an opportunity to investigate this problem a little more thoroughly to see, are we going to have this issue the next time we ship this product to this customer or another customer, right? So kicking off the process correctly, be it an RMA, a quality inspection, just a simple generic problem report, like I found a problem with this component, right? Here's, you know, here's the product. Here's this part of that product that is having the problem, right? Capturing information, like this is again, the default configuration of Fusion Manage lets us capture just as much information as you might ever want about a problem before anyone even has to take a look at, is this really a problem and how do we solve it? Right. Now, if you've got a simpler environment and you don't have 50 people feeding a system with problem reports and doing inspections and whatnot, that's fine. You can always go straight to say, we know we just have to we've got a problem, or maybe you don't have 50 people feeding your environment. They're feeding you in some other way through, creating something in SharePoint or even just sending you an email to get things started. You can just have, okay, a change request, which is, we know we got to fix something. We've got this problem. How do we work it to completion, right? And that's sort of the next step. So you could certainly use something like problem reports, nonconformances, quality inspections to kick off a process. You don't have to, but again, if you do something like this, you're gathering a lot of information and you're enabling yourself down the road to solve systemic problems more easily because you've got the information to do so, right? So sort of the next step in the chain, someone created a problem report or a quality inspection failed. What do we do? Well, now you need to investigate the problem, right? So if you notice, for my example here of this quality inspection, if we look at its status, sorry, it was a RMA. I closed that window. So if I go and look at an RMA here, any one of these RMAs, we can see a part of the process of this RMA is creating what's called a CAPA, corrective and preventive action, right? So that's one method, I would say, of reviewing a potential issue and ensuring that the right solution is provided, right? So in the context of Fusion Managed, again, I really like this, the way it's configured. There are a couple of ways you can deal with these problems as they come in, right? But again, there's really high risk for the process to break down here. Someone can raise an issue, they can raise an issue 50 times, But if we don't put in the right amount of effort, ask the right questions, and can answer those questions, those problems may never get solved, and they may get solved in a suboptimal way, right? Um, Especially if your problem reporting mechanism is, I send an email to a group and 10 people get this email. Everyone in engineering or everyone in this product line, gets this email saying there's a problem. Now, one of those 10 people has to pick it up and run with it, right? Or maybe it does go to one person, but then that one person is so overwhelmed, right? Um, and if it's an email, we all get way too many emails in a day. Things can get lost, right? But ultimately, if a problem comes up, you've got to, think about, how is this thing going to get solved? Who is investigating the problem? What's the scope of the investigation? What does it entail? Who's the decision maker? Who decides, is this a problem we need to solve? And if so, what's its importance, right? And then how do you close the loop to go back to the person that requested or raised the issue to say, yes, we've identified your problem and we've now resolved it. And by the way, if you see it again, let us know, because then maybe we've got a systemic issue we need to solve. Right? So this is where the change request and the CAPA, the corrective and preventive action, would come into play. Right? So the idea of the change request, you gather everything that's relevant to make decisions and communicate with stakeholders. A description of the issue, eventually, and this is sort of a living record, it evolves over the course of, of time. What's the issue? If you're using something like a problem report or a quality inspection in a system like Fusion Manage, the issue that was provided, say in a problem report, can be carried forward to this change request so that whoever came up with the problem, found the problem, and has described it, the information they provided doesn't get lost in the mix. It gets carried forward to another workflow where more people are involved to help solve the problem. So you're not losing information or having to re-communicate, playing telephone, things get mixed up, right? What someone provided at the outset gets carried forward. Eventually, after some investigation, there becomes, someone proposes a resolution. Here's what I found. Here's what I think we need to do to solve it, right? You have individuals involved, right, who requested the change because they identified this issue or they realized this issue is worth investigating. Who's doing the investigation? Who is approving? But I think most importantly is, with the default configuration, you can assign tasks to individuals and say, here's the person investigating the problem. Here's the person who is required to come up with solving the problem, right? Here's the person who's going to approve, our solution to this problem. Right? And you can put dates to these tasks and to the overall process, so that you can see, when is something coming up due. We decided we wanted to get this solved by Tuesday. It's Friday. It's going to take us 4 days to get the problem solved. We think maybe we're late already before the due date's even arrived, right? So keeping things running smoothly by assigning both individuals to tasks and keeping track of when things need to happen, you can do all of that with something like Fusion Manage, right? And going straight to a change request is usually best for simpler or obviously necessary changes. Like, we can't assemble this because of tolerances. Like, half the things we try to put together, they just don't fit. Okay, well, that's something we got to fix. It's pretty obvious. We've all looked at it. We sat there on the floor and looked at it. Let's just get a change request going and get it fixed, right? Now, the corrective and preventive action is a more detailed process. And, there are even some regulatory agencies like the FDA outline a specific process like this, even using this terminology, where it's a more detailed process for investigation and resolution, right? You define the problem, you measure it, you perform analysis, you work towards continuous improvement, etc. And this is, I would say, this process is less about getting a change executed and more about a more detailed investigation for both solving the problem and preventing future problems, right? A change request is more like, we've got a problem, let's solve it. A CAPA is like, well, yeah, we have a problem, but it might be bigger than we think. Let's take a good solid look at it and work it so that we can make sure that it doesn't become something more systemic, right? And even just like if we're now getting into the idea of identifying and resolving systemic problems, just following that process alone can help you find systemic and recurring problems and make sure they get resolved properly, right? So for example, failure mode and effect analysis, FMEA, is often part of a CAPA, where if we take a look at, say, how Fusion Manage would define these things, and we look at our quality management and go to corrective and preventive action, there's a workflow for this. If we take a look at a CAPA that's closed, for example, there's a process. So, maybe in the analysis step is where you do an FMEA. Now that could be its own process, right? That maybe involves different people that help solve a problem. And in fact, Fusion Manage, aside from its default configuration, there are lots of what we call apps. They're essentially just additional workspaces, additional functionality, all included. There's no extra cost for any of these apps, but there is an FMEA workspace, right? So, this is a process defined in Fusion Manage that has its own workflow, as we can see here. So, you can think of, especially when you get into more complex change processes, like if you do end up with a problem of this scope where lots of people are involved, the more compartmentalized, I would say, you can make the processes while making sure everyone has access to the data they need, the more efficient everyone's going to be, because you can keep their focus on that one compartmentalized bit that they're responsible for. But then those responsible for the big picture can see everything and how they all interconnect, right? That's what Fusion Manage is extremely good at. And that's an extremely powerful tool when you're trying to solve systemic problems, is being able to make sure each person who has a task can execute that task efficiently, keeping them focused, but having the ability to take a step back for those who need to see the big picture and how everything connects, right? So if we take a look at something like a corrective and preventive action, like so, we have, in the case of a CAPA, did a non-conformance lead to this CAPA? Did an RMA lead to this CAPA? Did a problem report? Did it result in a change request? All of this information is here at your disposal. So whoever's responsible for executing a CAPA, they may not need to get down into the details, like if they're just, performing the analysis, right? They have the bits of information they need from, say, the problem report or the quality inspection. They execute their analysis and they're done. But then big picture folks can step back and say, well, how did this thing start? And then what did it lead to? You can go back and forth through the chain very easily to see, okay, here was the problem. Here's how we decided to solve it. Here's what happened when we got into execution. And especially if a problem really didn't get solved, it's like, well, we thought we could solve it this way. When we got into the change request itself, it turns out we couldn't solve it that way. So we tried to do it a different way and it didn't quite work, right? So these questions that get really hard to answer when something goes wrong, if you've got a rich history of data, because people have just been keeping track of what they do and how they solve problems, you can start to make much better decisions, right? So as you start building up data in a system like this over time, problem reports, RMAs, that all get linked back to a component, right, to a specific part number, right? You can start to identify trends and then act on those trends to start preventing problems instead of just reacting to them. Right? And again, Fusion Manage has tools for that, not just looking through records and clicking all day, but reporting can be extremely effective, right? Because if we take a look, I'll just take a look at my homepage here. You know, I have several charts up here at the top, you know, inspection results. Right now, half of our inspections are failing. That's probably a big deal, right? We need to fix that. The number of RMAs we have, are they going up or down, right? Is there a trend here with RMAs? And this is all live data, right? These reports can be created by an administrator and shared with a lot of different people. You can create your own reports, right? But this gives you important key performance indices, KPIs, you know, a buzzword we probably all hear all the time now, right? But that can help you make real decisions, right? A problem report comes in your inbox and this part number, you're like, that part number looks familiar. It seems like we've had a lot of those. You know, you could go and look at the part number, you know, in your item master and see all of the related records, right? Here are all of the change requests or change orders that we've had executed against this. And I can see, well, okay, if nothing else, just looking at this record, we've had 5 change orders against this thing in the last 6 months, and they all seem centered around this one little bit. Maybe we need to take a closer look at that, right? Without having this data collated and easily accessible, it's just virtually impossible to make those kinds of draw those conclusions and have those insights unless you just have superhuman memory and bandwidth. And most of us just have too much to do these days to pull something like that off. Right. Right. So again, getting into the reporting, you know, you can report on any workspace in Fusion Manage. So you can say, how many problem reports have we had in the last 6 months? How many RMAs have we had? Like you saw that chart there. And again, all of these change management records can potentially be linked back to part numbers. So you got a quality inspection. That quality inspection involves a part. You know what part it is. You can look at all of the inspections you've done. You know, if you're, you know, following Six Sigma practices and you're manually inspecting some percentage of product, every one of those inspections can be captured and reported on to help you make decisions. Right? And then even if you want to take it a bit further for maybe not the things we make in-house, but the things we buy, you know, Fusion Manage, and I did a webcast about this just last month, about supplier management, right? So the things we're buying from others, that just adds a whole nother potential failure mode into the mix, right? Because there are certain things you can't control about what people make for you. And so keeping track of your suppliers, periodically auditing how they run their business or how they're making the parts for you, keeping track of when you've got a corrective action because you've got an issue with a part that you purchased from a supplier, you can add all of that into the mix too, right? Fusion Manage has an entire supplier management capability where you keep track of your suppliers and you can audit those suppliers. And you can have, again, in our apps, you know, we have the concept of a supplier corrective action request and quarterly business reviews. So again, keeping track of your suppliers, because now again, we're getting into resolving systemic problems, right? Well, we've had 5 problems with this thing out in the field in the last 3 months, and every one of those things has involved a component from a company that we buy, this company that we buy from. So there's nothing we can do about this until we start getting better parts from them, right? If you've got information about your suppliers in a system like this too, it can help you draw that conclusion more quickly. And then finally, moving on to smoothing out the execution in general. Right? So, you know, these everyday questions that, I even ask myself, in my business, because even if you don't have a system like Fusion Manage, if you're executing change, you've got some process today, right? So why aren't our problems getting solved more quickly? This particular change I know needed to be made to this. Why isn't it done yet? Where did it get stuck? At a higher level, okay, we've got, 12 ECOs open right now. How many of them are stuck? How many were stuck last month? And stuck is a relative term, right? If something didn't get, if something sat idle for 2, 3, 5 days, maybe we call that stuck, right? We've had a goal to improve our response time to requests for change. Are we getting there? Are we better this month than we were last month, right? Once you start to use a system like this and start tracking problem reports through requests and investigations through resolution, you can start to answer these kinds of questions, right? Again, contributing to continuous improvement, right? So as far as the tools that something like Fusion Manage would provide, where and why is a specific process stuck? Well, workflows define the process, right? So if we just look at a change request, for example, we can see the steps we've decided that need to be taken. So just at a glance, you can see right here, well, okay, we've got a lot of things still open. There's a lot of orange still on this list holistically. So just even at a glance, something like this, right? But if we look at a specific change, here's the process that we've said we want to follow. And, we can see when something entered a state, right? So this now has been in review and impact analysis for a long time, right? So why? What's going on with this? And, we can create tasks. There are none on this guy, but we can always create a task and say, get on this, right? Solve the problem. And I mean, it's very straightforward. And you can say, here's the person, right? Larry, I want you to solve this. And I'm going to check it when you're done, right? Now, just like that, we've given somebody something to do. We didn't have to have a meeting. We didn't have to send yet another email. They will get an email, right? If we choose on something like this, right? But, now there is something for this person to actually do, right? So we can keep track of that. You can assign to individuals. You can see what's open or not. We have the concept of, the schedule here. We have the concept of milestones, right? Where we can say we want this thing to be, hit the change order state, no later than March 6th, right? And if we're not within 5 days, if this hasn't been done within 5 days of our due date, warn us. Right? And so now we have a schedule just like that. This issue within just a few seconds, now we've put a date to this and we can see that date. We can see how it lays out. This ends up with a task on someone's dashboard, right? Where they can go and see they have something to do in their outstanding work, right? It can appear on their list of things to do. And if it's late, we've got a red flag, right? So now you've got something that needs to be done and it can show up here. So again, not just an email, but something if you use this every day, you come in and say, here's the things I have to do, and I can sort by due date and hit, the newest things first. This helps me prioritize, right? So this helps you identify where things get stuck and resolve those problems. Now, when it comes to the workflow and the process, again, not only do we have the concept of the process itself, let me get back to a change here. but any one of these required transitions. So if we decided, okay, once we have submitted this to investigation, if this isn't submitted to our change control board within 2 days, remind people, send them an email. And yes, we get a lot of email, right? But there's a chance somebody's going to see it, right? But it can keep this in somebody's, in their vision, right? If they get an email about this every day, eventually they're going to see one, right? So raising issues, making sure they're visible, right? That can help you determine where a bottleneck is and help remove it. Now, reporting is where you get into the more systemic, how many processes are stuck, right? With your processes designed properly, and the default configuration, I think is very well designed for this. How many processes are stuck? You could configure the system conceivably to say how many change requests have been in their current state for more than X days. That's conceivably something that you could report on in Fusion Manage. And that could show you how quickly things are getting done, how much motion there is, right? Which, unless you have yet another weekly meeting that interrupts what people are trying to do, it's hard to gauge that kind of stuff, right? And then eventually, over time, as more and more of this work is done and more data is added to the system, again, you can start to draw long-term conclusions and work towards continuous improvement. Right. So I hope this gave you some insight into the concept of change management and how Fusion Manage can help you address those changes, right? And change is really never simple or easy. I don't like change. I don't know a lot of people that do like change in general, right? But especially in an engineering environment, it can become tricky to execute and it can cause all sorts of problems, right? But it is manageable, right? But it becomes much more manageable if you can get sufficient and accurate information about the problems when they occur, right? Early visibility and clear visibility. If you get those problems investigated in a timely manner and act solutions quickly, right? And each of these steps sort of build on themselves. If you're engaging in continuous improvement, right? So you identify problems, solve them, get a scope of the problems you've solved so that you can prevent problems and engage in continuous improvement. And then as you're executing, you identify bottlenecks quickly and accurately so they can be resolved, right? Change becomes much more manageable if you can do all of these things. And Fusion Manage is very well equipped to help you do that. All right, I think with that, we will move on to questions. So I see we have one question that came up just a couple minutes ago. And I think this is a great question. So we're currently using Inventor and Vault. What would be the best approach to using Fusion 360 Manage? Can they continue to design within Inventor and use Fusion Manage as the PLM, or would you need to change to Fusion 360? Thank you so much for asking this question, because this is a particularly vexing one. So what we are looking at here is called Fusion 360 Manage. This product from Autodesk has nothing whatsoever to do with Fusion 360, the CAD application. The two don't even talk natively. So under no circumstances do you have to change anything you're doing about the CAD software you're using to use Fusion 360 Manage. Fusion 360 Manage does not manage CAD data. There's a cloud-based tool for that is included in a package with Fusion Manage. That's called Upchain. That's a discussion for another time, right? But if you're using Autodesk Vault today, you can absolutely use Fusion 360 Manage for enterprise-wide processes. And in fact, you can buy a license from Autodesk that includes both Vault Professional and Fusion 360 Manage Professional, right? So Autodesk understands the need for this. A lot of people are using Vault. Vault is a fantastic tool for managing CAD data. It is not well equipped for enterprise-wide process, right? If we take a look at Vault, it's great at managing files. It's pretty good at helping you create an engineering bill of materials. But in terms of change management and processes and problem reports and RMAs, Vault is not designed to do that, which is fine. I mean, that's not what it's designed for. So if you're using Vault today, especially Vault Professional, you can absolutely take Vault Professional and integrate it either with the item master, if you're using the item master in Vault, or if you're just managing files. You can extract information from Vault Professional and get it directly into Fusion Manage. It's a solved problem. There's integration for that off the shelf, essentially. So Vault manages your CAD data, your Inventor data, your SolidWorks data, your non-CAD data, all your files, etc. That manages the files. And then you can have a window, essentially, into your Vault from Fusion Manage, right? So what we're looking at here in Fusion Manage, these are all files that are in my Vault, right? And we can even see a couple links down here to the Vault. So I could even call up my Vault Thin client from here, right? And apologies for the flashing. That's an issue I have on my system with Thin client login, right? If I can get myself logged in here real quick. Right, so I can actually go straight from Fusion Manage to my Thin client if it's deciding to work for me specifically today, and that's struggling right now. But this will take me right to my Vault, essentially. So this is information about the component in my Vault. I can go to that if I need. If I'm just doing process stuff, I don't have to worry about that. As a viewer, I can actually look at the DWF that was created in the Vault, can get uploaded straight to Fusion Manage. So if I don't even have anything to do with Vault, I can still look at my data here, very much like I would in the Vault Thin client. But again, I don't have to worry about, being on the company network even. This is fully cloud-based, right? So I know I just spent about 5 minutes answering a question that could have been a yes or no, but bottom line is, if you're using Vault Professional or just Vault in general and Inventor today, you can essentially bolt on Fusion Manage for process and not change anything you're doing with CAD. All right, any other questions? We'll give it just another minute for any more questions. I haven't seen any pop up recently. Okay, I don't see anything coming in, Ashley, so we'll go ahead and wrap up. If you do end up typing a question, we miss it, we'll follow up with you independently, but, oh, wait, sorry. 2 more questions just came in. Sorry, Ashley.
Sure.
Yeah, a whole bunch have just come in. Wow, okay, so would the change orders continue with Vault, or could they now be done in Fusion Manage? That's another great question. Tyler, your questions are awesome. So they're actually designed to work together. My philosophy when it comes to change management in Vault, the change order functionality in Vault, I think, is great, even though it's hidden from my interface right now. But this is not this is the Vault Professional change process we're looking at here right now. This is a nice process. It is not an enterprise-wide change process. That's not what it's designed for. It's great for within engineering, in my opinion. So it is absolutely possible with Fusion Manage, and again, it's integration that is essentially off the shelf, for us to either start a change process in Vault that could then kick off an enterprise-wide change process in Fusion Manage, or more commonly, what might happen is in Fusion Manage, if we end up with a change request, there's a step here called change order in progress. Now there's a change order workspace in Fusion Manage to help the enterprise-wide parts of this. But if we're talking about to the point where we need to change CAD data, we need to work on the files. And so what is absolutely possible is when our change request gets to the change order step, that can automatically kick off a change order in Vault, so that the Vault, and even down to the point where the related documents can get associated with the change order. All of that is possible. So that, again, just by people doing their job in the system that they use, other people's work can get prepared for them. So the change process in Vault is complementary to Fusion Manage. One is not necessarily a replacement for the others. Okay. So there's a question about the commenting features in Fusion and Manage 360, right? So that would, somewhat of a general question. If we're talking about, say, commenting on like a viewable, I'm not sure if we can do that. Comments in general, like if we're talking about a workflow action, anytime you are executing workflow, you could force someone to provide a comment. What do they have to say about this approval process? This is optional where you can require a comment or not. Other ways, I've had customers ask for like almost like a message board or a forum is how I might describe it, where you want discussion about something. There's a concept of what we call a grid tab this would be a grid tab here where you could have, people can make comments here. It just kind of depends on what you need. So another question, if you use Vault with a file-based setup and not an item-based setup, is the integration any more complex? Not necessarily. The issue really comes down to one of, I think, bill of materials completion. So a great thing about the Vault item master is you can use the Vault item master to get to a complete bill of materials a bit more easily than you would, say, with Inventor, because you don't have to worry about virtual components and things like that. But if you don't want to have anything to do with items in Vault, you could still use the integration with Fusion Manage to extract the bill of materials that Vault still knows without going all the way to the item master into Fusion Manage, and then you could complete your engineering BOM in Fusion Manage. And another question here, what are the typical setup time and cost considerations to implement Fusion Manage? That's another great question. So cost, I get in trouble if I start talking dollars in terms of like license cost. I will say the cost, in my experience with similar software, the cost for something like Fusion 360 Manage is significantly less than its competitors. Okay. If nothing else, from a pure, what does a license for a user cost? The cost is significantly lower, like sometimes as much as, half to a third or less, depending on exactly what you're doing. So that's a considerable reduction. So if you're already looking at PLM software, Fusion Manage is what we would call PLM. If you've looked at PLM software and you've not considered Fusion Manage, you should really take a look at it, but not just from a cost perspective, but just for what it can do. and how easy it is to implement. So everything we've looked at today so far is the default configuration. So if you know your change management process is out of whack, or if you need something more complex than you're doing today and you want to use all the things we looked at, you order Fusion Manage, basically you buy it, it gets turned on, and that functionality is there, and it's just ready to use. So if you want to use it exactly like it is, there's very little implementation time. Now, in my experience, our customers, they always want things to work a little bit differently, sometimes a lot differently, right? The time to implement can really vary dramatically depending on how much different you want the configuration to be. But I will say, and some of our customers have seen this firsthand, this system is so easy to configure compared to other systems. Just yesterday, I was in a meeting where customer requested a change to the workflow. We want the name of this step to be different. We don't like the letter CCB. Or one person in the group didn't like that concept of a board. So while we were talking, within 10 seconds, I was able to go make a change. I asked the person to refresh their screen, and the workflow was different, right? I worked in other PLM systems where I would never dream of attempting something like that, because making a simple change like that is so complicated. In Fusion Manage, it's dead simple. If you know what you're doing, you can configure and make things work extremely quickly. The approach we take to implementation is often, we will enable you to do as much as you are willing and able to do on your own, right? If you'd like us to do all of your configuration, basically discuss with you what you want and configure a system turnkey to make it work how you want, we can do that. If you want to take charge and understand how it works under the hood and learn how to maintain it and expand it, we will enable you to do that, right? So the short answer, because I fail terribly at giving short answers, but the short answer when it comes to implementation time is it could be literally anywhere from days. Usually it's on the order of weeks. Sometimes it could be months depending on the scope of it, but it's usually somewhere from days to weeks. All right, I'm not seeing any other questions come in, and we're just about at the top of the hour, so I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up there, Ashley. Thank you.
Okay, well, great. Great presentation, Forrest, and thank you all for attending and asking those questions. Once again, if you could take a few moments to fill out the short survey, we do appreciate that. And also look out for that email tomorrow, which will contain a link for the recording of this presentation that you can watch again. Thank you for attending and have a great day, everybody.